Development Committee of the Metropolitan Council. We are a quorum of the committee and can do the body's business. First, colleagues, the first item of business is approval of the agenda.
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion, changes? Seeing none, all in approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? That carries. Next are approval of the minutes of the November 4th, 2019 regular meeting of the Community Development Committee. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion? Discussion. Seeing none, all in approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? That carries. We will move then into our business items. The first business item is 2019-322, the City of Farmington 2040 Comprehensive Plan and Comprehensive Sewer Plan. Mr. Boylan, welcome.
Thank you, Chair Lindgren. My name is Patrick Boylan. I'm the second representative in local planning assistance for Districts 13, 14, 15, and 16. Here to talk to you tonight about the City of Farmington's 2040 plan. Mr. Tony Whippler, Plan Director, is here from the City of Farmington in the audience tonight. The regional systems for the City of Farmington include two interceptors that bisect the city heading towards the Empire Wastewater Treatment Plant, a couple lift stations, a trail search corridor in the kind of south central areas, that kind of spray can yellow look symbol, and two regional trails in the city. And just also point out Highway 50 that runs east-west, sort of near the southern border, just north of the Lake Marion Greenway Regional Trail, and that connects Interstate 35 with Highway 3, which connects the city to St. Paul. Community designation for the community. Thrive has designated Farmington as the emerging suburban edge, and Farmington is located in the kind of west central Dakota County, surrounded by the communities of Lakeville, Empire Township, Castle Rock, and Eureka Township. Forecasted growth for the communities as follows from the staff report. Between 2020 and 2040, the council forecast city will grow by 8,200 people, representing 3,300 households, and there'll be an increase of 1,200 jobs in the city at that time. Just a note, don't think I ever usually show this, but this is sewer growth, which is a little different than the forecasted growth. This is the city submitted a sewer growth plan that was slightly different than the system statement plan of 2015, showing a slight increase in the number of households and population served by regional sanitary sewer. The staff's philosophy here is that the local planners and their consultants know best with kind of what the most accurate numbers are. Their numbers revised upwards are within our confidence that we not only can serve this, but that it's accurate and not anything terribly extravagant in terms of an increase. So that's why that's a little bit different, and that's why that appears as Table 2 in your staff report. And that will be upon completion and final review of the plan, those numbers will be revised upward officially. The residential density is in front of you. As an emerging suburban edge community, the city is expected to plan for at least 3 to 5 residential units per acre. This shows land uses between the years 2020 and 2040, showing the representative minimum maximum densities. Overall, that we expect, the city expects 1,261, a little over acres to develop, and a range of 4,414 units to a maximum of 10,975. And that's an overall density of 3.3 to a maximum of 8.7 units per acre, which meets Thrive policy for residential development for emerging suburban edge. The existing land use in the city, there's a lot of pale green, that would be agricultural, and then of course the developed urbanized areas is the pale yellow, and that's residential. Pretty common for a lot of suburban development communities. The sort of more regular grid pattern in the south and eastern areas, their original downtown. Farmington's a standalone community served by rail and state highway on its own. You know, really the Twin Cities urbanization, suburbanization sort of coming to meet the city at this time. The future land use shows continued growth in their urbanized area and their single-family neighborhoods. You see an expansion of that in the yellow, pale yellow, and then some brown, which is high-density residential. You see additional institutional office and industrial uses along Highway 50. That's that road that is an east-west road, and then continued intensification of their downtown area. The findings in the staff report are that the plan conforms to Metropolitan system plans. It's consistent with council policies. It's compatible with the plans of adjacent affected jurisdictions. The meeting schedule is this evening. We are meeting to, that's not quite right. Sorry, it is correct. My mistake. So tonight we're reading this, but last week the Environment Committee met to review this, and that the full council in early December, on December 11th, will receive and review the final plan. The proposed action in the staff report before you tonight is, to authorize the city of Farmington to place its 2040 plan into effect and advise the city to implement the advisory comments and review record for surface water management and wastewater. As said, Mr. Whippler is here, and I'm available for any questions at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Mullen. Mr. Whippler, thanks for joining us tonight. Any questions on that report? Questions? Seeing none, Mr. Boylan proposed action to authorize the city of Farmington to place a 2040 comprehensive plan into effect and to advise the city to implement the advisory comments in the review record for surface water management and wastewater. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Thank you. A second?
Second.
Thank you. Discussion on that motion? Any discussion? Seeing none, all in approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That carries. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next business item is 2019-328. It's the Anoka County 2040 Comprehensive Plan, and Rhea S. Smiley will present. Thank you,
Hi,
Mrs. Smiley.
thank you, Mr. Chair, council members. I'm Raya Smiley. I'm the sector rep for District 4 and local planning assistance, and I'm here to present Anoka County's 2040 comprehensive plan. I would like to let the committee know that Karen Blaska, the county's parks planner, and also Jack Forsland, the county's transportation planner, are both in the audience today. Thank you for coming such a long way. So this map shows the location of regional system components within Anoka County. Within the county, there are 7 regional parks, 1 regional park search area, 1 park reserve, 8 regional trails, and 5 regional trail search corridor. It's also important to note that Anoka County is a park implementing agency. There are several principal arterials located within Anoka County. That's I-35, I-35W, Trunk Highway 10, Trunk Highway 65, 169, 242, 610, and County Road 42. North Star Commuter Rail currently serves Anoka County, as well as North Central and I-35W North alignments, and both of those are part of the increased revenue scenario in the transportation policy plan. There are several meters, lift stations, and interceptors within the county. However, the county does not have any jurisdictional control over centralized wastewater collection or treatment issues, and therefore it is not required to submit a sewer plan. As shown here and also in figure 2 of your staff report, Thrive designates communities within the county with 8 different community designations, and all of those include urban center, urban, suburban edge, emerging suburban edge, rural center, diversified rural, and rural residential. The county does not have any land use authority within the cities and townships of the county, so there are no land use planning requirements that need to be addressed by the county either. Table 1, also in the staff report, shows that between 2010 and 2040, the council forecasts that the county will grow by over 79,500 people, representing over 35,000 households, and there will be an increase of 18,760 jobs in the county within the same time frame. So the proposed findings are that the plan conforms to the Metropolitan System plans, is consistent with council policies, and is compatible with plans of adjacent local government units and affected jurisdictions. Again, since the county is not required to do a sewer plan, this plan is only scheduled to be on the Metropolitan Council's meeting on Wednesday, December 11th of 2019. So with that, the action before you is to authorize Anoka County to place its 2040 comprehensive plan into effect, advise the county to implement the advisory comments in the review record for transportation and housing, and within 60 days after receiving final DNR approval, the county must adopt the MERPA plan and submit a copy of the final adopted plan and evidence of the adoption to DNR, Council, National Park Service within 10 days after the adoption. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. I would also want to remind you that Karen Blaska and Jack Porcelain are in the audience for any additional questions.
Thank you, Mrs. Smiley, and thanks to our visitors from Anoka County. Any questions on that report? Any questions? Seeing none, Mrs. Smiley has proposed a series of actions authorizing the county to place its 2040 comprehensive plan into effect, advising the county to implement the advisory comments in the review record for transportation and housing, and within 60 days after receiving final DNR approval, the county must adopt the MERCA plan and submit a copy. Is there a motion for approval?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion on that motion? Any discussion? Seeing none, all in approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? That carries. Thank you, Mrs. Smiley. Our third business item is 2019-316. It's the Mississippi Gorge Regional Park Master Plan from the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board, and Mr. Kelly will present. Welcome, Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, council members. As was stated, I am Colin Kelly, Regional Parks Planning Analyst, and I'm here to present the Mississippi Gorge Regional Park Master Plan on behalf of the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board. First off, some context for you. Mississippi Gorge Regional Park is located pretty much at the center of the regional park system in east and southeast portions of the city of Minneapolis. The maps you see here are essentially figures 1 and 2 in your staff report. The regional park also connects to other existing and planned units of the regional park system, which I'll talk more about in the next slide. Because of this location, the regional park is fairly well served by mass transit, including Metro Transit routes 9, 21, 23, 46, 53, 67, 74, and 121. The regional park is also a short distance from both the blue and green LRT lines. In Minneapolis, Mississippi Gorge Regional Park encompasses approximately 265 acres and 5.5 miles of riverfront flanking both the east and the west banks of the Mississippi River. It is part of a larger continuous regional park system along the river that connects to the Central Mississippi Riverfront Regional Park to the north and Minnehaha Regional Park to the south. Mississippi Gorge Regional Park is also served by 2 National Scenic Byways, including the Great River Road and the Grand Rounds. And the park will connect to the planned Grand Rounds Missing Link Regional Trail, which came before you in September. Finally, the regional park also lies within the Mississippi National River and Recreation Area, which encompasses a 72-mile stretch of the river corridor from Dayton and Ramsey to just south of Hastings. Chapter 6 of the master plan provides information on regional park improvements and recommendations using 3 planning scales: the overall master plan approach, focus area recommendations, and parkway and trail recommendations. The overall master plan approach is to balance park and recreation opportunities with protection, preservation, and restoration of natural resources and river ecology. The plan also reflects community input received throughout the planning process, and it proposes new park facilities and programs that address park user requests. Chapter 4 of the master plan focuses on community and public engagement and outlines the variety of groups involved in the planning process and the types of engagements that occur, from open houses and pop-up events to online surveys and listening sessions. The listening sessions were focused around meeting with community groups, cultural groups, and other key stakeholders in spaces close to them and at times of the week most convenient for them. The master plan also proposes ways to improve access and connectivity to, from, and within the park, addressing Americans with Disabilities Act or ADA accessible picnic areas, the entryways to Southeast Flats and Longfellow Flats, and many other improvements. Finally, the master plan considers two possible futures for the regional park, with and without the nearby dams on the Mississippi River. Each future offers different circumstances for the river's character, ecology, and recreational opportunities. This regional park consists of natural areas, parkways, paved and unpaved trail corridors, and urban park spaces. The natural areas and park spaces within the regional park provide destinations for community gathering, passive and active recreation, nature hikes, bird watching, and many other activities. Several destinations in the park were identified during the planning process as focus areas for future regional park improvements and capital investments. The focus areas include Bohemian Flats Park, Riverside Park and Annie Young Meadow, Longfellow Flats, Oak Savannah area, East River Flats Park, and the Southeast Flats area. The recommendations included in the staff report are those that have been prioritized through community engagement efforts. Some of those recommendations include an improved trail connection to the University of Minnesota's West Bank with stairs or an ADA accessible trail up the slope at Bohemian Flats, a nature play area in the Glen between Riverside Park and Annie Young Meadow, including intensive invasive species removal, the installation of signage, wayfinding, interpretation, bike racks, and trash receptacles at Longfellow Flats, and a boardwalk on seasonally flooded areas of the trail at Southeast Flats. Parkways make up much of the land that park users know and experience within Mississippi Gorge Regional Park. They are located within regional park boundaries and provide conduits for the movement of vehicles, pedestrians, bicyclists, roller skiers, and others. They also provide immediate access to and from the regional park from surrounding neighborhoods. An important goal of the master plan is to create an interconnected system of safe and convenient trails between parks, natural areas, and recreation facilities, and connect them with residential areas, civic institutions, businesses, and other community destinations along the corridor. Community engagement activities identify trails as one of the most heavily used resources in the park, and as such, a high priority. Enhancing the park's trail system and associated trail amenities are key objectives of the park master plan. Some of the trail-related recommendations include designing trails and sidewalks to meet or exceed ADA accessibility standards, evaluating opportunities to improve natural surface trails throughout the park, designing and installing wayfinding signage that will help make trails more accessible and easier to navigate, and locating benches and restrooms at regular intervals along the park's length. Council staff find that the Mississippi Gorge Regional Park Master Plan is consistent with the requirements of the 2040 Regional Parks Policy Plan, namely Planning Policy Strategy 1, Master Plan Requirements, and other council policies. And so the proposed action before you is that the Metropolitan Council approve the Mississippi Gorge Regional Park Master Plan and require that the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board, prior to initiating any new development of the regional park, send preliminary plans to the Metropolitan Council's Environmental Services Division to assess the potential impacts to the regional interceptor system. I should note that the Metropolitan Parks and Open Space Commission voted unanimously to approve the proposed actions at its meeting on November 7th. And with that, I'll stand for any comments or questions you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Any questions on that report? Any questions? Seeing none, Mr. Kelly has proposed a pair of actions to approve the Mississippi Gorge Regional Park Master Plan and requirements prior to initiating any new development. Is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
Thank you. Second?
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion on that motion? Discussion. Seeing none, all in approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? That carries. Thank you very much, Mr. Kelly.
Thank you.
The fourth business item is 2019-317. That's the Park Acquisition Opportunity Fund Grant for St. Croix Bluffs Regional Park in Washington County. Ms. Lee, welcome.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chair and committee members. My name is Jessica Lee, and I am a senior planner for Regional Parks. I'm here to present business item 2019-317, Park Acquisition Opportunity Fund Grant for St. Croix Bluffs Regional Park, the row property for Washington County. St. Croix Bluffs Regional Park is located in the southeastern corner of Washington County along the St. Croix River. The map on the left shows the Washington County park system. St. Croix Bluffs Regional Park is circled in red. The map on the right shows the council-approved park boundary with the dotted orange line. Washington County currently owns the 579 acres shaded in green. They are requesting a POF grant for the 102-acre row property, which is shaded in blue. After this acquisition, there will be only one 20-acre inholding left for the county to acquire. This property has a high natural resource value. About half of the property is in its natural state of mixed forest, wooded ravines, and bluffs. The rest of the property will be restored back to its native state of oak savanna and mixed hardwood forest. Additionally, acquiring this property will protect 1,000 feet of St. Croix River shoreline. After this acquisition, St. Croix Bluffs Regional Park will contain and protect nearly 5,000 contiguous feet of shoreline. Because of the high natural resources value of this property, we are able to use funding from the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, or ENRTF. The purchase price of the property is $2,935,000, which is 106% of the appraised value. With ENRTF funding, we are allowed to pay up to 110% of the appraised value, but need permission from the Legislative Citizen Commission on Minnesota Resources, or LCCMR. We will be presenting to LCCMR on December 12th for their approval to use ENRTF. Washington County needs to close on this property immediately after LCCMR approval, as their purchase agreement expires December 31st of this year. So this acquisition will be funded with a mix of ENRTF, Parks and Trails Legacy Funds, and council bonds for a grant amount of $2,228,599.65, and Washington County will provide a 25% local match. A rationale for recommendation is this acquisition is consistent with the 2040 Regional Parks Policy Plan and state fiscal year 2020 Parks and Trails Legacy Fund appropriation requirements, fiscal year 2016 and 2018 Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund requirements, the St. Croix Bluffs Regional Park Master Plan, and Washington County is within its $1.7 million per year limit each for Parks and Trails Legacy Fund PAOF funding and ENRTF PAOF funding. So with that, my recommendation here tonight is subject to the Legislative Citizen Commission on Minnesota Resources approving the purchase price, the Metropolitan Council approve a grant of up to $2,228,599.65 to Washington County to acquire the 102-acre row property located on the St. Croix Trail south of 90th Street, Denmark Township, for St. Croix Bluffs Regional Park, and to authorize the Community Development Director to execute the grant agreement and restrictive covenant on behalf of the Council. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Lee. Any questions on that report? Councilmember Cummings.
Thank you, Chair. Is there an effort undertaken to acquire that little 20-acre parcel that?
Ms. Lee.
Yes, Chair, members, there is intent to purchase it someday when it becomes available. At this time, the property owners are not looking to sell.
Thank you.
Thank you. Further questions on that report? Further questions? Seeing none, Ms. Lee recommends two actions to approve a grant up to $2,228,599.65, subject to the Legislative Citizen Commission on Minnesota Resources approving the purchase price. Is there a motion to approve? Thank you.
Second.
Great. Any discussion on that motion? Any discussion? Seeing none, all in approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? That carries. That takes us to our next business item, 2019-318. It's the Park Acquisition Opportunity Fund Grant for 9 Mile Creek Regional Trail in the Three Rivers Park District. Ms. Lee.
Thank you again. My next item is business item 2019-318, Park Acquisition Opportunity Fund Grant for 9 Mile Creek Regional Trail, the Wanner Easement for Three Rivers Park District. The 9 Mile Creek Regional Trail is located in the southeastern portion of Hennepin County. This map shows the full extent of the regional trail, which goes from Hopkins to Minnetonka, Edina, Ridgefield, and Bloomington. The Wanner property is located in the Edina East segment of the trail. The Wanner property was the last property needed to complete the Edina East segment of the 9 Mile Creek Regional Trail. Three Rivers Park District acquired an easement for this final section through condemnation in 2015. Three Rivers received a $6 million federal grant to construct the Edina East segment and was at risk of losing their funding if all easements were not acquired prior to June of 2015. They followed all proper procedures to acquire this easement through condemnation and are now seeking reimbursement through the PAOF program. These images show the Wanner property. The one on the left shows the 9 Mile Creek Regional Trail highlighted in yellow and the easement parcel located or circled in red. The image on the right shows the completed trail. The trail was built on the edge of the property and no buildings or private infrastructure were impacted. The appraised value for this easement was $28,700. The final purchase price was $73,400, with a total project cost of $95,000. The grant amount of $71,250 will be funded with Parks and Trails Legacy Fund and council bonds, and Three Rivers Park District will provide a 25% local match. Our rationale for recommendation is this acquisition is consistent with the 2040 Regional Parks Policy Plan, State Fiscal Year 2020 Parks and Trails Legacy Fund appropriation requirements, the 9 Mile Creek Regional Trail Master Plan, and Three Rivers Park District is within its $1.7 million per year limit for Parks and Trails Legacy Fund PAOF funding. And our recommendations are to approve a grant of up to $71,250 to Three Rivers Park District for the 2,300 square foot Wanner easement located at 7125 Ohms Lane in the city of Edina for 9 Mile Creek Regional Trail. To authorize the Community Development Director to execute the grant agreement and restrictive covenant on behalf of the Council. To consider reimbursing Three Rivers Park District up to $23,750 from its share of a future Regional Parks Capital Bonding Program, and inform Three Rivers Park District that the Council does not under any circumstance represent or guarantee that the Council will grant future reimbursement, and that expenditure of local funds never entitles a park agency to reimbursement. And with that, I can take questions.
Thank you, Ms. Lee. Questions on that report? Any questions? Seeing none, Ms. Lee has proposed a series of actions or recommended a series of actions relative to this grant. Is there a motion for approval?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Councilmember. Any discussion on that motion? Discussion. Seeing none, all in approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? That carries. And Ms. Lee, it's your final item for tonight, 2019-332. It's the Equity Grant Program Pilot and the 2019 project recommendations. Ms. Lee.
Thank you, Chair. My final item tonight, as you just stated, is business item 2019-332, Equity Grant Program Pilot 2019 project recommendations. We recently completed our review process for the Equity Grant Program Pilot. Regional Park implementing agencies submitted applications in August. They were allowed to submit multiple applications, but are limited to receiving a maximum of $200,000 each this year. 9 of the 10 agencies submitted applications. We received 14 eligible applications totaling $1,256,755. The review committee first met on October 17th to receive the applications and instructions on the scoring and review process. The committee was to be comprised of representatives from MPOSC, the Community Development Committee, Equity Advisory Committee, and external equity experts. It proved challenging to get participation from external experts, and we ended up proceeding without those representatives. The resulting 7-member review committee reviewed the projects on their own time and provided scores to council staff. Then they met again for a final review and discussion meeting on November 5th, where the committee was presented with the final scores and rankings of the projects. The review committee discussed the overall quality and thoughtfulness of the applications and developed an approach for recommendations. The committee considered each project and its potential equity impact, and ultimately there was consensus that the ranking from the scores should determine the funding allocations. The committee also wanted to honor the spirit of a pilot program and only recommended using the $300,000 of 2019 funds for this round of applications. The fund distribution plan states that an additional $331,000 of 2020 funds may be available, but the committee felt that we could use lessons learned from our pilot year to improve the process and have another round of funding next year. So 3 projects have been recommended for funding. The highest ranked project was Dakota County's Dakota Homeland Interpretation along the Minnesota River Greenway Regional Trail. Dakota County requested $90,000 and will match it 100% with their own funds. They have worked with 4 tribes in the region to develop a conceptual design for Dakota Homeland Interpretation along the Greenway Corridor. The application asks the agency to identify an equity focus area for the project, welcoming underserved populations to the Regional Park Service, accessibility, racial equity, or equitable use of regional trails. Dakota County self-selected all 4 equity focus areas for this project. The second highest ranked project is the St. Paul Walk-On Teepee Center at Bruce Vento Regional Trail Nature Sanctuary. St. Paul self-selected 3 of the 4 equity focus areas for this project, welcoming underserved populations to the regional park system, racial equity, and equitable use of regional trails. They requested $154,255 for this grant, which is a small part of a $6 million project. This grant will help support fees for a Native American architect to design the Walk-On Teepee Center, and it will also pay for public art and exhibits. The third project selected is Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board's Bede Makaska Cloudman Memorial Interpretive Signage for the Minneapolis Chain of Lakes Regional Park, which focuses on racial equity and welcoming underserved populations to the regional park system. This project is part of a larger $475,000 project, which was funded partially by the City of Minneapolis's Art in Public Places. The larger project improved trails in and around the village site and created a large-scale public artwork. This grant will help fund the remaining part of the project, which is the interpretation of the Dakota history of the lake. They requested $136,500, and the committee has recommended a grant of $55,745 to bring the total 2019 funding recommendations to $300,000. Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board has confirmed that they are happy to accept partial funding for this project. The 11 projects not funded are shown in the business item. The review committee discussed each project to provide feedback for the agencies. Over half of these projects scored within 10 points of the top-rated project, which highlights how competitive this pilot program was. Our proposed action tonight is that the Metropolitan Council approve funding 3 projects totaling $300,000 for the 2019 Equity Grant Program pilot for the regional park system, as shown in Table 1 of the business item, and authorize the Community Development Director to execute the grant agreements on behalf of the Council. And with that, I'll quickly add that Council members Atlas Ingebretson and Lee both participated in the review process and may have additional comments. Otherwise, I'm happy to answer questions at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lee, and thanks to our colleagues for serving on the review committee. And I would just point out that 9 implementing agencies submitted $1.2 million worth of projects. So it shows that this pilot did generate a lot of interest, and I applaud the review committee's guidance to not oversubscribe, but to take lessons learned from this round. And this is sort of our first pilot program was inherited from the last council, so our thanks to those who served. But it was really the first kind of programming that we got to kind of sink our teeth into, and it was really a rewarding process. So our thanks to staff for supporting us in that. Comments, questions from the committee? Yeah, Councilmember Vento.
Mr. Chair, I'm going to abstain from voting on this, although I don't think there's a conflict of interest. I have been involved as a volunteer and a supporter of the Walk-On Teepee Center, so I'll be abstaining.
Thank you for that, Councilmember. Councilmember Atlas Ingebretson.
Yeah, I thought as the liaison for the Metropolitan Parks and Trails Open Space Commission, and for the council and a participant, I thought I would share just a few thoughts about the process. One, just to remind council members that we had limited funds, $300,000, and also additional limitations, although there was some creativity that was supported through the process for capital projects. Mm-hmm. The other piece that I wanted to share is that we did get to an agreement as a review committee, so there wasn't any kind of contention other than our desire to do more, and trying to figure out how we could do that. And it was also a process that came together really quickly. We needed to make these decisions prior to the end of the year, and scheduling within that time frame definitely got to be a bit challenging. So appreciative of all the staff and other commissioners and community members that were engaged. We had representation, not just from MPOS, but also from the Equity Advisory Committee as well. I think it's a good first step, and there's a lot more work to do in this area, and that's what we learned in the pilot. So there's a lot of opportunity for us to clarify, to hone the process, and that's why we wanted to hold on not dipping into the funds for next year, so that we can make it that much more successful for the implementing agencies. And I think that I'm glad to hear support of that for staff. Also wanted to acknowledge that the top, those that were selected were the top through the process of the review and the rubric, and to acknowledge that they all did an excellent job at really engaging the populations that they were looking to impact, and that shown in their applications, and also acknowledge that they're about this happened to be the case. You never know how other people are going to rate something, but there was a lot of congruency, not 100%, but a lot of congruency that led to them getting there, and that they all are focusing about making sure Indigenous populations, historical spaces are recognized. And I could anticipate maybe someone asking about that, but I think of how many times have we allocated resources and never have had Indigenous communities a part of those resources. So I actually feel really good about being a part of this process and having a very diverse group of people come to this kind of conclusion. Starts to feel restorative. So I just thought I'd share that.
Well, thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to say there's a great deal of detail and passion on the side of the project proposals, and that speaks to the demand and the need and the passion of the implementing agencies. And I want to commend the staff for the thoughtfulness that they put into the rubric. Like my colleague said, there are a lot of things we got to work out, but the categories we had so far were pretty thoughtful. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Cummings.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, thank you, Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen and Councilmember Lee. Very, very challenging. I just want to recognize how hard it is when you have $300,000 and $1.2 million in requests. I mean, the demand is so great, and to have them score 10 points under, what a challenging mission for you to figure out the best way to do this. I think it's extremely good idea to not designate the 2020 funds as well, and to wait and see. I love the idea of fine tuning, because I'm sure you learned lots and lots of lessons on that. I thank you. I think it's great that you involved the EAC and that they had their voices heard, and we're trying to find more and more ways to make sure that they are heard and that we're incorporating their advice into what we're doing. So I thank you for that. I think this is great. I respect the process. It's very challenging, and so I think this you did a great job, and it's much appreciated.
Thank you, Councilmember. Further questions, further discussion? Ms. Lee, I have a question. I'm not sure if it's for you or maybe Emmett or maybe even Director Barajas, but what is next then? So clearly there's interest in the region in the equity grant program, as demonstrated by this pilot. There's lots of interest on this committee and on this council as well in continuing to promote equity and access to our regional parks. And so what's next in this for this pilot?
I can only speak for the immediate future. We're currently working on adjusting our fund distribution plan for the 2020 grant cycle. And we do hope to move forward and have a 2020 funding cycle with the $331,000 that's left.
Okay, thank you. Emmett, did you want to say something as well?
Good afternoon, committee members. I'm Emmett Mullen, the Regional Parks Manager. Thank you for those words of encouragement. This has been a long and challenging process, but a really good one. So Jessica pretty much covered exactly what I was going to say. We do have 2020 funding lined up. We have $331,000 for the next year. Um, we also did get a lot of really good suggestions through the review process on how we might improve the program for next year. So we're going to take a step back. We've already met as a staff team a couple times. We're going to survey the review committee members as well as the park implementing agencies to get some feedback on how they would suggest improving the process. So we have a few things to do, but Jessica, very organized person. We're going to be back early in 2020 with a fund distribution plan. One of the comments that Council Member Atlas Ingebrigtsen has said is, let's get these review committee dates earlier onto our committee members' calendars so that it can be more possible to get better participation, because we were honestly rushed trying to get a recommendation through before the end of 2019. And I really appreciated all the committee members' patience with that kind of a squeezed process. But it was a good process.
Thank you, Mr. Mullen.
Thank you.
Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
I think there's some work for us to consider as a council, and that is every time we've talked about funds for equity work in the parks multiple times in different kinds of full council meetings and other spaces. I think we need to think about as our council, what's our commitment to advancing this work beyond the initiation of the previous councils starting the ball in this area. I think what I hope is that we can learn also from what we glean from this, so that it's not just influencing what the 2020 funding process looks like, but also what we need to take away from it as a council to inform what we want to have our addition to this work look like. There are other funding opportunities that we'll be talking about in 2020. I'm thinking earned business, the earned revenue, interest earnings. Thank you, Emmett. That and how that could potentially be leveraged to support equity efforts. Oftentimes when we talk about them, and I encourage my colleagues here to remember, right now we only have resources for capital investments, but when we really talk about equity and parks, it's really programming is the piece we're really missing out on, and that's what often people think of. So we just need to remember right now we don't have the resources for that, and that will be a conversation that we'll be having in 2020. So I think the next step for us is for us to really think about what do we really want to be invested in doing as ourselves, as the council.
Thank you, Councilmember. Any further discussion? Questions? Ms. Lee has proposed action that the Metropolitan Council approve funding 3 projects totaling $300,000 for the 2019 Equity Grant Program pilot for the regional park system, and to authorize the Community Development Director to execute the grant agreements on behalf of the council. Is there a motion to approve? Thank you, Councilmember. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Councilmember. And really with thanks to our colleagues here, but the staff and everyone that was involved in moving this through in such an efficient way. Our thanks. Any discussion on the motion? Discussion. Seeing none, all in approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstain? And 1 abstention. That motion carries. Thank you, Ms. Lee, for all of your work. And our final business item for tonight is 2019-334. It's the 2019 Livable Communities Demonstration Account Funding Recommendations. And Ms. Gary, welcome, and also welcome Mayor Emerson. Thank you. Yeah.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and committee members. I'm Hannah Gary, a senior planner with the Livable Communities Act, and I'm here to present the 2019 Livable Communities Act demonstration account grant funding recommendations. And I'd also like to introduce Mayor Jo Emerson, who is the chair of the Livable Communities Advisory Committee, and she'll be co-presenting the recommendations with me today.
Welcome, Mayor Emerson, and thanks for your service to the council and the region.
So there are 2 funding recommendation options presented to the committee today. The first option will fund all eligible projects up to the $7 million allocated in the Lcda development program fund distribution plan. This will award partial funding to 2 projects and will not fund 1 project. The second funding option authorizes the transfer of $1,808,200 from the Lcda TOD account to fully fund all 9 eligible Lcda projects. Projects funded through the Lcda program are demonstrations of projects that meet goals set by the Council. Connecting development to transit, intensifying land uses, connecting housing and employment, providing a mix of housing affordability, connecting communities, and attracting investment. I'll now give a brief overview of the application and evaluation process for Lcda grants. Applications go through a 2-step review process. The first is with an internal review committee based on criteria approved by the Council. All 13 applications met the minimum score requirement this round and moved on to Step 2. Step 2 is a review by an external review committee, the Livable Communities Advisory Committee. The external review committee assesses applications based on innovation and demonstration, catalytic value, and readiness. 9 of the 13 applications that came in met the minimum score in both Step 1 and Step 2 to be eligible for funding. And a brief overview of our calendar for this year. The fund distribution plan was adopted in February, which was followed by a notice of funding availability. In the spring, we offer optional design workshops and convene top designers and architects to review project proposals with applicants and offer feedback to encourage best design practices and to support livable community development. There are 2 workshop sessions to provide applicants with the opportunity to review continued project progress. 8 projects went through the design workshops, and 5 of those projects came in through the full application process. All applicants submit a project concept plan, which this year was due in July. For the first time this year, we also required applicants to attend a brief meeting with Lcda staff to discuss their project concept and go over eligible activities. 15 concept plans were submitted this year. Full Lcda applications were due on August 8th, and we received 13 applications. As I mentioned earlier, all 13 of those applications advanced from Step 1 to Step 2 and were reviewed by the Livable Communities Advisory Committee. In the 2019 Fund Distribution Plan, the Council made $7.5 million available for Lcda development and pre-development programs. Of that $7.5 million, $500,000 was allocated to Lcda pre-development funds. 3 applications came through the spring pre-development round with awards totaling $260,000. The 13 applications that came in had requests of over $12.5 million. There's an additional $1,818,200 available in unallocated Lcda TOD funds. The LCAC is recommending that the Council transfer these remaining funds to the Lcda Development Program for a total of $8,818,200 to be available to fund additional projects. According to Council guidelines, no more than 40% of available funds may be awarded to projects located in Minneapolis and St. Paul. The remaining 60% of funds are made available for suburban projects.
This is the funding breakdown of project requests and LCAC funding recommendations. 9 of the projects met the minimum score requirement of 60 to be considered for funding. The 4 projects in red did not meet the minimum score, so they are not eligible for funding. To maintain the 40% funding limit for Minneapolis-St. Paul projects, the committee is recommending partial funding for the 927 building project if the Council elects to pursue funding option 1, which does not transfer the remaining TOD funds to the Lcda account. In this scenario, the 4100 Edina project would receive partial funding and the Owasso Gardens project would not receive funding. In funding option 2, all 9 eligible projects would receive full funding and no more than 40% of available funds would be awarded to projects in Minneapolis and St. Paul.
Choose between one and two.
And we'll now give a brief overview of each of the projects that are being recommended for funding this year.
Springbox is a multi-use project proposing a public plaza, community gathering space, programming for an artist market, and support for local artists on the site of a former used car lot on University Avenue. Springboard for the Arts has already been programming the space as part of their community engagement efforts around the project. In addition to the community gathering space, Springboard will move their main offices to this location. Recommended funding is for the full request of $392,500, which will support placemaking, stormwater management, and site preparation.
Bloom Lake Flats in the city of Minneapolis is an all-affordable housing project with 42 units of supportive housing for residents living with HIV/AIDS. Supportive services will be offered through Claire Housing. Both indoor and outdoor community gathering spaces are incorporated into the project. This development team had strong partnerships through the City of Minneapolis, Project for Pride in Living, Claire Housing, and the Family Partnership. The funding recommendation is for the full request amount of $1.6 million to support site acquisition, site preparation, stormwater management, and renewable energy.
Amber Apartments in Minneapolis will create 81 units of affordable housing for residents recovering from drug and alcohol dependency. 75 of the units are more deeply affordable at 31 to 50% AMI. Developer R.S. Eden has a strong history of providing supportive services for residents. Due to close proximity to the 46th Street Light Rail Station, on-site parking has been reduced to less than one stall per 3 units. The recommended amount is for the full request of $548,500. This will support stormwater management, site preparation, and renewable energy.
7200 and 7500 France in the city of Edina is a mixed-use, mixed-income project that's proposing 311 residential units, 10 of which will be ownership townhome units, and 62 of which will be affordable at 51 to 60% of area median income. The project includes 3 public plazas, a pedestrian boulevard, commercial, retail, and residential uses. The project concept came out of a public engagement process around realigning 72nd Street. The funding recommendation is for the full request amount of $1,895,000. This award will support placemaking, site preparation, public parking, renewable energy, and stormwater management.
The 927 project in Minneapolis is a partnership between the Phillips Family Foundation, New Rules, Tri-Construction, and the City of Minneapolis. This is a reuse project located in a historic building on West Broadway Avenue. The new development will include office space for the 3 partners, community event space, pop-up retail, music, and gallery space, as well as a maker space on the lower level. A public plaza behind the building will be programmed for community gatherings. Electric vehicle charging stations will also be available for visitors. The recommended amount of funding is for the full request of $981,816. This amount is available in the Option 2 funding scenario. In Option 1, $259,000 would be made available for the project. The award amount would support placemaking, site preparation, stormwater management, and renewable energy.
Main Street Rogers in the city of Rogers would bring 104 total housing units between workforce housing and senior housing to the city. In addition to retail on the first floor along Main Street, the senior center in the community would be relocated to this site. A public plaza between the 2 buildings will be programmed by the city for community events. The recommended award for this project is for the full amount of $942,500. This will support site acquisition, site preparation, placemaking, and stormwater management.
Paravel Castle Ridge in the city of Eden Prairie is a project that will bring 246 new housing units to the city, 50 of which will be affordable at 31 to 50% AMI. The project will also incorporate a rainwater cistern to reuse rainwater for irrigation, permeable pavers, low flow fixtures, green roof features, EV charging stations, green roofs, and ample bike storage. The award recommendation is for the full request amount of $885,000, which will support site acquisition, site preparation, and stormwater management.
4100 Edina in the city of Edina would bring 70 units of affordable housing to the Southdale area. 8 of the units will be available for residents making at or below 30% of area median income, and the project would include larger unit sizes to support families living or wanting to live in the area. The project is on the site of the former Flight Time Studios building. The project team plans to incorporate this history into the new development by working with local artist Tacumba Aiken, who did the original artwork in the studio. The recommended amount under option 2 is for the full request amount of $493,950. Under option 1, the project would receive partial funding at $477,500. This award will support stormwater management and site acquisition.
Owasso Gardens in the city of Roseville is a project which will bring 60 units of affordable senior housing to the area. The project will be designed based on universal design principles to support residents aging in place. The project team plans to work with the community and a local senior group to hold design charrettes to include community and resident voice into the project. The recommendation under option 2 is for the full request of $645,000. Under option 1, this project would not receive funding. If option 2 is chosen, the funds would support site preparation, site acquisition, and ongoing community engagement.
And again, there are 2 funding recommendation options presented today. The first recommendation is that the Metropolitan Council award 8 livable communities demonstration account grants totaling $7 million and authorize its community development director to execute the grant agreements on behalf of the council. And the second recommendation option is that the Metropolitan Council authorize the transfer of $1,818,200 from the Livable Communities Demonstration Account Transit-Oriented Development Program to the Livable Communities Demonstration Account Development Program. Award 9 Livable Communities Demonstration Account grants totaling $8,384,266 and authorize its community development director to execute the grant agreements on behalf of the council. And with that, I can take any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Gary and Mayor Emerson. And I'll just remind my colleagues that at the last council meeting when we approved the Lcda TOD grants, there left the balance of 1.8 million roughly. And so those are the funds that we're considering transferring in option 2. So questions on that report? Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
Thank you, Chair. I have a quick question, or 2 questions. One, after a project's completed like for Springboks or the Project 927, who's the owner of the buildings or properties? Both were described kind of as partnerships, and so I'm just curious, like, where does that ownership lie for the properties after?
Ms. Gary.
I can double check on the details of that and get back to you in terms of ownership.
Thank you. Further discussion, Councilmember Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a motion I'd like to make. I propose a motion to include funding the Parkway project from the City of St. Paul under the option 2 scenario within the funding limit of no more than 40% of available funds being distributed to projects located in Minneapolis or St. Paul. This will fund the Parkway project at $4,464.
Thank you, Councilmember Lee. So just to be clear from a process standpoint, that's different from the recommendation, correct?
That is correct.
Do you have that in writing, Councilmember, or?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Yeah, do you have that in writing? Can you share
I do.
that? Thanks. And then this would be an amendment to the action. Is that what we're proposing? Thank you. Okay, thanks. So I think first, what I would do, Councilmember Lee, if this is agreeable, amenable to you, is ask for a motion, correct? And then we can amend it. Or Director Barajas?
Mr. Chair, council members, the committee can make any motion that they choose.
Okay.
There's recommendation in front of you. If you'd like to work off of a recommendation that's here and make a change, you can do it that way, make the motion simple.
Oh, okay, so this would be just the main motion. That's all, okay. Councilmember Lee, looks like you worked with staff to prepare this motion.
Yeah.
Okay, so Councilmember Lee's motion includes the option 2 funding with this additional action. Do council members want to see this? Should we pass it? And let's see, discussion on that.
You need a second.
Oh, yeah, could I have a second, please? Is there a second?
I'll second it for discussion purposes.
Thank you. And then discussion on the motion. Councilmember Vento, then Councilmember Cummings.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's my understanding that the list that we see on slide 8 is the ranking based on the points they received, correct?
Yes.
So, Councilmember Lee, I really appreciate your desire to address this, but my concern is that we'd be leapfrogging over 2 higher ranked requests, the Anoka request for Anoka Senior Housing and the Plymouth request for Four Seasons. And I don't feel comfortable doing that. I also don't feel comfortable usurping the role of the committee that did the work on this, that went through the process of ranking and reviewing. And so I would speak against the motion. I do speak against the motion.
Thank you, Councilmember. Further discussion on Councilmember Lee's motion. Councilmember Cummings?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think Councilmember Vento said it really well. I would have difficulty, again, we have these advisory committees, they put in a tremendous amount of time, effort to score these, to rank these, to take as much of the politicization out of the decisions. And I think that supporting these, the work of the committees is really, really crucial to the process. And I think the process is really, really important. I too would have difficulty leapfrogging and changing the motion as it's currently made.
Thank you, Councilmember. Further discussion on the motion. Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
At the beginning of the conversation, I heard you mention that there was an option 1 and option 2. I didn't see that well articulated in the presentation. So can I get, did I mishear that? And if I didn't, can I get another explanation about the option 1 and the option 2?
Point of information for Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen. Ms. Gary.
Thank you, Chair, council members. The difference between option 1 and option 2, option 1 would stick with the funding limit that was originally set in the fund distribution plan, which allocated $7 million to the Livable Communities demonstration account. Option 2 would bring over just over 1.8 million that's remaining in the TOD fund to fully fund all eligible projects. And the LCAC, the External Advisory Committee, found significant value in all of the eligible projects, and their recommendation is to transfer over those TOD funds to fully fund eligible projects in the LCDA account.
Councilmember?
Just a point of clarification. If I'm reading the scores right, they're not in numerical order from top to bottom in the slide on slide 8, based on the scores. Is that, am I right? The total column?
Ms. Gary?
They do not descend or ascend in order of ranking.
The rankings that are listed, I don't believe include the housing performance score in terms of order listed. And the base criteria to be eligible for funding does not include the housing performance score.
That's right. Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen?
So the scores that they're ordered by are different than the scores that we're seeing currently as their totals.
Ms. Gary?
Chair, council members, the order is based on, and I can go back to the slide, the combined step 1 and step 2 score, and then housing performance scores are added on.
But
So it would-
not total
it would be
in that
this-
total column.
Right, it would be this third column. The rank order is done on the third column, which does not include the housing performance score. And the housing performance score is done after we determine eligibility for funding, and projects that are located in communities that have a housing performance score lower than the average score then receive the average for that cycle.
Councilmember.
I just encourage us to think of a little more transparent and clear way to present this information, so that we know that we're incongruent with the work of the committee and that there's no accidental mistakes that are made there. And that maybe the way that we present the projects, if it is a matter that we make decisions based on the ranking related to the score, that's the way the information is presented to us completely, even for those not scored, so that also when the public sees that information, they're able to see it transparently and that it's congruent with what happened at the committee level.
Thank you, Councilmember Ziegler. Councilmember Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for all your feedback. I apologize for being abrupt. This project is right in the heart of my district, and the city council. This all happened really quick within the last week and a half. The city council person and the developers met with me, and we talked about the project. And the project was from the 2-point scoring system, was just 2 points shy of the system. And I was really passionate about the project because our demographics on the east side of St. Paul are changing. And the project really prioritizes multi-generational housing with multiple bedrooms. The housing crisis, we all know about that. And especially with the changing demographics more among Somali Korean families on the east side of St. Paul. There are more generations under one roof for a lot of these ethnic groups. And that's why I was really passionate about the project. And that's why I brought it up. And in addition to that, a lot of my constituent officials feel that, with the exception of some larger projects like the Gold Line, the east side is disinvested from the Met Council in infrastructure. And so that was part of the feelings that kind of helped spurred me into making this recommendation too. But I do appreciate all the other points that my colleagues have made.
Thank you, Councilmember. Further discussion on Councilmember Lee's motion. Councilmember Cummings.
Just a comment. I appreciate, Councilmember Lee, your representation of your district in bringing this up. I think that's important, and appreciate that you did. And like the previous grant allocation that we just went through, it is so hard because there are never enough resources to fund all the things that we would like to fund. And I think that it's very, very challenging to allocate the funds so that we can do the most benefit with the values that we share and are trying to promote. So thank you for that. Again, I think, just to reiterate, I think it's really, really important to respect the process and the amount of work and time and effort and expertise that the committee brings to this. And enough said.
Thank you, Councilmember. And Councilmember Lee, I really appreciate your representation of your district and your engaging to the depth that you did on this project. I'm not going to support your motion today for the reasons that our colleagues have stated. And just last cycle, it was in a similar situation with the Minneapolis project that was very well supported by the local community. But I chose rather to respect the process, respect the scoring, and it is difficult. That's what made the additional funds available actually to transfer on option 2. So again, with thanks for your work and your representation, I won't be supporting the motion. I have Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen, Councilmember Bento, and then Councilmember Lindstrom.
I guess I have a question, Chair, about, and maybe it's a point of clarification. We're in a situation of persistent inequities because something in our systems aren't getting resources and opportunities to spaces that need them. So one of my questions is, what is our capacity as members of CDC to just also take a look at the policy level, at the rubrics? We've had two. This is our first time going through this. We've had two that have, as you mentioned, had strong community support that are about affordable housing and population geographic areas that are historically under-resourced. So what is it possible for us to just see the rubric, just to take a look at it and better understand the process? And if my math was right, again, we had a little bit of conversation about this 1.27 difference between this and the one that made the cut. So realizing that there's a place where you draw that line and respect that, but I just think it would be helpful, especially for our conversations with constituents, to have a better understanding of the rubric and the process.
Director Barajas, did you want to respond? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Lilliger and council members. The like the Equity Grant Program, the Livable Communities Program also has a fund distribution plan. It is looked at every year before we make funding available and applications available. So we will be embarking on that process with all of you and looking at the criteria, the funding allocation, and how that works. In January-ish, we typically apply or put out fund distribution plans by end of February, early March. So we don't have a lot of wiggle room, but that's where between now and then we will be working with you on getting that next FDP ready for release for next year's grant program.
Councilmember Allison.
Is it possible to see the current rubric?
Absolutely, happy to share it.
Thank you, Director Barajas. Further discussion, Councilmember Vento.
I'll pass.
Thank you. Councilmember Cummings. Oh, I thought you were okay. Further discussion, Councilmember Landstrom.
Thanks. Also, a point of clarification that the motion calls for $4,464. And I'm curious on that number. I understand that there's limits with the 40%, but it strikes me that $4,464 is not going to go too far on a project like the one we're talking about.
Thank you.
You know what? I'm kind of curious. What's the point of a $4,000 allocation for this? I imagine multi-million-dollar project or very large project.
Thank you. Chair, council members, that remaining just over $4,000 keeps within the total amount that was left after moving over the TOD funds. That keeps the guidelines that no more than 40% of available funds be allocated to projects located within Minneapolis and St. Paul. And then the remaining 60% of those available funds are allocated for projects outside of the two core cities.
Thank you.
Thank you. Further discussion on Councilmember Lee's motion, Councilmember Vento.
No, I'll save it for.
Okay.
Sorry, I was going to ask a question, but it was going to get very complicated, and it doesn't need to be asked tonight. So.
Further discussion on Councilmember Lee's motion. Further discussion. Seeing none, all those in approval, please say aye. Opposed? Nay?
Nay. Nay.
Do we need a division? I would say that did not pass. That didn't carry. Thank you. I would entertain a motion for either. Well, I would entertain a motion.
I move option 2.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion on the motion? Discussion, Councilmember Atlas-Singer.
I had one other question. One was about the 4100 Edina project, and I'm just curious. It shared that there were 8 units at 30% of AMI, and I'm just curious, what's the total number of units in that project, and was there any additional affordable housing at the 60% of AMI, for example?
Ms. Gary?
Thank you, Chair, council members. At the 4100 Edina project, there are 70 total housing units. 8 would be available, affordable at less than 30% of AMI. 30 would be affordable at 31 to 50% AMI, and 27 are affordable at 51 to 60% AMI.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. Further discussion on Councilmember Mento's motion. Further discussion. Seeing none, all in approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, nay. That wasn't voting. I voted aye on that. Thank you. Any abstentions? Seeing none, that carries. I thank you very much, Ms. Gary, for your work, and Mayor Emerson, thanks for your work and for being here.
Thank you on behalf of the committee.
Thank you.
It's
Please
a tough decision.
I'm sure.
It really is.
Thanks. Please convey our
Give
thanks.
money to everybody if we could.
Right. And I want to thank so many representatives of so many projects that came down for this. We don't always have such a big audience for our committee meeting, so thank you.
I was wondering why there's so many people.
Yeah, I know.
As we're moving out,
thought there
before
was
we move
staff.
on to our information
Like-
item, I wanted to give Director Barajas the floor to make an announcement.
Thank you.
Director Barajas, do you want to wait till it?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll wait till it quiets down. Again. Director Barajas.
Thank you. Before turning it over to Terry for a really good discussion, I just wanted to announce, as you all know, that Paul Burns has retired, and in his place we have selected Tara Beard, who is in the audience. I wanted to introduce her as our new Livable Communities Manager.
Did you want to say something?
Yeah, Tara's been with the council for some number of years now that I can't recall. 6 years, and has been working on housing policy, is one of our chief authors of our housing policy plan, and has been working closely with Livable Community staff on many of the housing related portions of the program. So we feel confident in her skills, both as a staff employee, but also with her experience having worked in the city of Hopkins, in the city of Minneapolis, and doing local planning work to really round out that experience and bring that to her new role as Livable Communities Manager.
Great. Thank you, Director Barajas. Ms. Beard, congratulations on the promotion and on all the great work you're going to do for the region. So thank you. Welcome. Great. We'll move on to our information item, Twin Cities rents and Metro HRA payment standards discussion. Ms. Smith.
Thank you for having me. I guess I have less people to put to sleep. Really weird. My goal is
I'm sure they're
to
still
awake.
listening in on streaming.
So I have sort of a lengthy presentation today, but my goal today is to set up for an action item that I'll bring before you at our next meeting, December 2nd. And I'll say in my 20 years working here at the council, and most of those involved in setting rent limits for the housing authority, this year's the toughest. And so I want to set that forth because the decisions you will all have to make are tough. I think Councilmember Cummings said in the last presentation, we don't have enough money to do everything we want, and this will be an example of that. But what I'm hoping to do is set the stage for setting rent limits at a future meeting and provide you with enough information and some options for discussion to help us accomplish that yet this year. So I'll start with, there's council policy direction that helps with setting rent limits. And if we're following what is in the council policy documents, Thrive will statements provide direction on this and state that we will offer housing options that give people in all life stages choice in where they want to live in our region. Thrive also states that we will develop and provide tools, including competitive rent limits in higher cost communities to enable voucher holders to choose a location that best meets their needs. And then a new goal that came out of your recent gatherings with your colleagues, the council's housing goal that says we want to become a region with a broad housing spectrum where all people can thrive. So I'll set the stage with that slide, and then I'm going to jump into it. Just know that I'm happy to take questions as we go, but I have a lot of slides, so if I'm going to cover it in a future slide, I may defer your question until I get to the appropriate slide, if that's okay, Mr. Chair.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Smith.
So payment standards are really rent limits. They're amount needed to rent a modest rental unit within our region. It's the amount that is given to voucher holders when they're out shopping for a unit with which to use their voucher. These payment standards are limited by fair market rents that are issued by HUD of October each year. and I should have this underlined maybe, but they increased by 5.3 to 7% this year. And the differentiation comes with different bedroom sizes. But that's a very, very large increase. Last year we experienced a similar increase. They were 5 to 7% last year. So when you look over the increases over the last 2 years, there's significant increases that have then significant budget implications for our program. HUD requires that housing authorities and the council set payment standards between 90 and 110% of the fair market rents that are issued, and that's to give some local discretion and some to allow for some local market-driven decisions to be made. Our goal is always to set rent limits high enough to allow choice in all neighborhoods, but low enough to serve as many families as possible, and really balancing those two things. When fair market rents are issued in October, we go through an annual review process. We've been partnering very closely with our colleagues in research this year, so I want to publicly thank Joel Hudding, who really helped me dive into this. But they helped provide us with access to CoStar, a database that includes lots of rental data. We also purchase rental data from Housing Link, but both provide average rental information by bedroom size and by community. That helps us analyze where our current payment standards are. We also review rent burden of currently assisted families. So how many and what percentage of the families that we're currently serving are considered rent burden? So those that are paying more than 30% of their income towards rent. That's something we look at when we're adopting payment standards. And it's all these things that help us recommend payment standards for our program. We have some challenges going on here in our region, and none of these will be new to you. I've had conversations with you previously. Joel Hudding, the research manager, has talked about this, so it's no secret that our vacancies rate here in the Twin Cities remain very low, at or below 4%. When vacancy rates are low, rents go up. That's continuing to happen here in our region. In fact, over the last year, rents have risen about 3.5% since last year at this time. And another problem with that is federal funding is not keeping pace with that. So we're issued a budget from HUD every year with which to manage our program, and a typical inflation factor on our HUD budget is about 1%. So you can see there that there's a gap in what our market's doing and what our federal funding is doing. And so what this all comes down to is that we're not able to serve all the possible families within the federal funding anymore. And this has been the case since 2017. Rents rising, federal funding not keeping pace. And there's a 1-year lag in our funding. So current year spending predicts future year funding. So what we spent last year, we will get this year plus about a 1% inflation. What we spend this year, we will get next year with about a 1% inflation. That's all dependent on congressional appropriations, but in theory, that's how this works. This slide illustrates how average per family subsidy impacts what we can do. So the higher amount that we're paying on behalf of each family lowers the number of families that we can serve. And if there are two takeaways from this slide, or a few takeaways, you'll notice that our average annual historical per family cost has risen about 2% per year. And this is true going back many, many years. But the average annual subsidy growth per family since 2016 is 5%. So you can see where, the line kind of goes up there, and federal funding, again, is not keeping pace with this. This shows the same sort of talking points in a different format. For example, our 2020 budgeted subsidy budget for 2020 is $61 million. And that's how much money we have to serve families. On the right side, it shows how many families we can serve with different average subsidy amounts. So if the average per family subsidy is $750, we can essentially serve all of our families. We can serve about 6,700 families. If that average per family cost goes up to $775, we're reducing the number of families we serve by 200. If the per family average cost goes up again to 800, we're reducing again by 200. So the takeaway is a $25 increase in average per family subsidy decreases service to about 200 less families. And so that kind of shows it in a different light. Tenants pay about between 30 and 40% of their income towards rent. If they rent a unit within the payment standard or within the rent limit, they pay 30% of their income towards rent. If they rent a unit that's above the payment standard, they pay 30% of their income plus the difference. And I'm going to show you how this plays out in a couple of slides. The message is the rent maximum is different for each family. In no case can a family pay more than 40% of their income when they move into a unit. So that impacts the maximum subsidy amount available for each family. I think it's important to point out that the 40% maximum only applies when a family moves in. So a family moves into a unit, maybe they're paying 40% of their income towards rent because they rented a unit that's over the rent limit. A year later, their landlord increases the rent by $100 because they're already at the rent limit. That comes out of their pocket. And that becomes a difficult decision because then it becomes a family choice. Do they want to stay in their current unit and pay that additional amount and become more rent burdened? Or do they want to move to a lower cost unit, assuming they can find a new unit? So that's sort of the struggle when we talk about these rent limits. Here's a 2-bedroom example that shows how this plays out. Let's say in this example, family A is renting a unit for $11.75. They pay electricity. You might remember my last action item was on utility allowances. So here they pay electricity, so they pay an additional $57 directly for their electric bill for a total gross rent of $12.32. The 2-bedroom payment standard is $12.50. So you can see their gross rent is below that. They pay 30% of their income towards rent. In this next example, let's say the rent is $1,200 plus $57 for electric. So the gross rent is $1,257. As you can see, that's $7 over the payment standard. So in this case, the family is going to pay 30% of their income plus the $7 difference. And that amount can go up, up, up until it hits 40% of family's income.
Ms. Smith, question from Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
So it's still the first year of us being here, so I'm saying I have rights to ask questions that maybe I should know the answer to, but we hear a lot of things over and over again. So when we
we're on a timeline for that.
Yes,
Yeah.
I give myself a year. This might be a 2-year thing. I don't know. Maybe it's a never thing. But Chair, what I'm curious about is when the council approved minimum rent. Where does that fit into this equation?
Ms. Smith.
Councilmember Lilligren, so that fits into the equation when a family is at very low income. So when 30% of a family's income is less than $50, that $50 minimum rent kicks in and they wouldn't pay less than $50. It doesn't play into rent limits because rent limits are about the rent, what it costs to rent a unit, and a family's always going to pay 30% of their income or $50 now, whichever is more. We haven't implemented that yet, but we're getting close. So it's sort of disconnected from rent limits.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Smith.
So some considerations. HUD says, here's your budget, Met Council. You're going to get $61 million next year. Now go out and serve as many families as you can, up to 6,727, which is the number of vouchers we have. There are some caveats to that. If the council chooses to adopt higher rent limits, that results in average per family subsidy, higher subsidy levels because the council's paying more on behalf of each family. It results in potentially fewer vouchers issued. It results in higher success rates, so it means that people that get vouchers will likely be able to use them because the limits are high enough. And then I have it builds future year funding. I said current year spending equals future year funding. Spend more, get more. Conversely, if we adopt lower rent limits, that lowers the average subsidy, so we could potentially serve more families. There are more vouchers issued. We have lower success rates, so that means a family that gets a voucher may not be able to get it because they can't find a rental unit within the limit. And then it risks future funding. Spend less, get less. You will recall from earlier this year that although the council is able to use program reserves specific to the Section 8 program to pay for subsidy, we cannot use other local funds such as general fund levy. So that option is off the table. We are close to our target fund balance for our program. So really we're faced with serving families within the budget that we get is what we're faced with in 2020 and going forward. This is a map of our service area, and currently, and going back to 2011, the council has adopted 2 sets of payment standards. One set for most of the communities within our service area, which are covered in those gray areas, and then exception standards for some high rent communities. Today we have 13 higher rent communities, so families that live in those blue areas get a higher rent limit because the rent is higher in those areas. The white areas are areas that the council does not serve with the Section 8 program. So that's our current scenario. What I'm going to talk about you today is 3 options that we have. These certainly aren't the only 3, and there can be options in between. But the 3 I'm going to use to illustrate our options are a status quo option, and that's where we don't have any increase from our current standards. So the rent standards we have today, we just adopt the same ones going into the next year. The second one is I'm calling status quo plus, and so this is having the same framework as we currently have, so having 2 sets of rent standards, but having an increase based on the fair market rent increases that occurred. I have a typo in this slide that I want to point out. Under status quo plus, that's supposed to say increase by 5% to 7%, because that's what the FMRs did. And I see it says 3%, so know that that's a typo. And then the third option, which will be new, is new to us as a council, is small area fair market rents. And that's where we adopt rent standards by zip code. So it's a more localized approach. Under option 1, the status quo option, again, we'd be keeping our current standards and bringing those into the year 2020. This really pushes the burden onto the families and is really almost like a decrease, because we know fair market rents went up by 5 to 7%. And we know in most cases rents continue to go up. If the council is not increasing rent limits to match that, the extra burden falls to the family. So families that aren't rent burdened today will become rent burdened when their rent goes up. Families that are rent burdened today will become more rent burdened as their rent goes up. But under this scenario on the pro side, it's the most budget neutral, so it allows us to serve the highest number of families. I will say if they can find units within the rent limits. On the con side, it increases the family's rent burden. So again, it pushes the burden onto the family. It's difficult for families to use their voucher. Again, they have to, when we set rent limits, they have to be able to find a unit to match that. And then it limits choice for families. So families will be somewhat limited to low rent areas in the region. If we were to go with this option, know that rent standards would be close to the lowest possible allowable under the federal regulation, which is at about 90% of the fair market rent. 93%, I think, is where it's at. Under option 2, which is the status quo plus, this is where we would be increasing the rent standards by about the same amount as the fair market rent increases, so about 5 to 7%. Under this option, rent limits, for example, the 2-bedroom fair market rent increased by 5.5%. So that would mean we would increase the 2-bedroom rent limit by 5.5%, so that same amount. On the pro side, it increases voucher placement success, reduces family rent burden. So some families that are rent burdened now would no longer be rent burdened because we're increasing that limit. It increases access to rental units. So it opens up more rental units within the market. On the downside, of course, it costs more per fill in the blank. It's supposed to be family. Costs more per family. It reduces, it could reduce the number of families served by 190. So implementing this option costs the council about $1.8 million, and that's enough to serve 190 families. So I'm not saying if we adopt this option January 1st, we're cutting the voucher from 190 families. Over time, the attrition would reduce. And what I'm saying is this costs $1.8 million more. So it would reduce the service to families over time. But I think it's important to say under this scenario, it's still difficult for families to rent in those high cost areas. When we look at the maximum we can go is 110% of the fair market rent. When we look at some of the high rent communities, that's still not enough to rent a unit based on the average rent in those communities. Yet I should make clear that this reduction would occur through attrition. No family would lose their voucher under this scenario. And then the third option that I'm probably going to talk the most about because it's different for us is a potential to adopt small area fair market rents. And what this means is if we would adopt rent limits that are calculated at the zip code. That's the most localized strategy that allows for higher rent limits in higher rent areas. But then the important part is it balances out with lower rent limits in lower rent areas of the region.
Ms. Smith, question from Councilmember Bento.
Have any other regions in the country done this?
Ms. Smith.
And if they have, what's been their experience?
So Councilmember Lilligren, I'm going to dig in a little bit on the next slide, but so I think I'll save it because it'll put it in better context if that's okay.
Is that fine with you, Councilmember?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
And so it's a more localized strategy. It's more market driven. It improves housing choice in all neighborhoods. So it would be, pretty high rent limits in some neighborhoods and lower rent limits in lower rent neighborhoods. It increases voucher placement success in all areas of the region. And I have this as future years budget neutral. And what I mean by that is the way this is implemented, it's implemented over a 2-year period. And so once it's fully implemented, and there will be some discussion in future slides about how this can be implemented, but it takes time to be implemented, having that balance between the lower rent areas and the high rent areas. The cons of this, it's the most expensive option for the council today. It would cost about $2 million to implement or impacts program size by about 210 families. There are some areas that will experience a reduction in rent limit from where they are today. And I would say this one would be the most administratively burdensome. When I looked at this option a year ago, I looked at it and thought 120 zip codes, no way can we handle that. It's complicated for us. It's complicated for the families we serve. Talked to some of my colleagues and my pal, Joel Hudding in research, who said we can build you an app in an hour to do this. And you plunk in the zip code and you get the rent limit. It's a tool our families could use. It's a tool our staff could use, and we would do some education on that. So I've changed my mind on that. So the current methodology used by HUD on fair market rents has been around for many, many years, so it's old. In 2017, so this is fairly new. The final rule for small area fair market rents was issued in January of 2017, and these are again zip code based limits, and it sets a more localized versus adopting limits for an entire metropolitan area. It's more localized to a large service area like ours. Along with this rule came a mandatory implementation for 24 areas in the country. So HUD said most housing authorities, there's 4,000 housing authorities. Most of you can have discretion whether you want to adopt this, but 24 areas you need to use these small area fair market rents. And those are primarily areas that are have small numbers or no voucher holders living in what HUD is calling high opportunity areas, areas that have access to high performing schools, that have lower crime, that have lower poverty, and that typically have high rents. And so those are 24 metropolitan areas that use small area FMRs as a mandatory policy, and they're San Diego, San Antonio, Sacramento, Pittsburgh, Dallas, Chicago, but it's brand new. So we're talking with our colleagues across the country that have, so this notice came out in came out January 17th of 2018. So although the final rule was passed in 2017, the rulemaking didn't come out for a year later. So it's brand new for housing authorities across the country. The only agency that's implementing it voluntarily that I know of is the Baltimore area. And part of it is the council is unique in its service area, and that we are serving families across a large service area with 100 communities where the rents are all over the place. For example, when we're looking at small area fair market rents, for a 2-bedroom, they range from $800 to $1,800. That's a huge spread in just that example. So to adopt small area fair market rents makes sense for an agency that has a large service area. For the Bloomington HRA, makes no sense. You know, for St. Paul and Minneapolis, it probably doesn't make sense. But for people that are serving a broader service area, it seems to make sense. This was also one of the things you'll remember we talked, I've talked to you about the operational assessment and how we can do our work better, smarter. This was one of the recommendations in that report that, you know, they recommended that we look at this, and it's also a recommendation of HUD as we've been working with them in their shortfall team this year with our budget issues. It's one of their recommendations. But the whole idea of this is intended to provide families with a choice of units in low poverty areas that they may not otherwise have access to. This slide is meant to show the tenant impact. So if we were to adopt small area fair market rents today, this chart attempts to show the impact to current program participants. The idea is, as there are decreases in tenant rent as a result of this, there are increases to council rent payments and vice versa. In areas of the region where a tenant would experience an increase in rent limit, that would decrease the council. So it's like a teeter-totter effect here. Based on who we're serving today, where they live today, and the rents that they're paying today, there are 42% of tenants that would have no change in their rent limit, or in their rent portion, excuse me. There are 6% who would receive a $1 to a $49 decrease in their rent payment. There are 4% that will experience a $50 to a $99 decrease in their rent payment. And I don't need to read the chart. You can see what it says here. I think what's probably most alarming to you is families that under this scenario would receive an increase in their rent portion. And there would be 25% of tenants would receive an increase in rent portion if this were implemented today, anywhere from $1 all the way up to $150 or more. And the percentages are smaller as the increases get bigger, but it's something that we need to talk about as we talk about this policy decision. There is, if the council chose to implement small area fair market rents, there would be a few choices. And one of those is there you could make a policy decision to hold current tenants harmless from a rent increase. So essentially, the families here at the bottom that would experience a decrease, if the council chose to hold tenants harmless, those families would not assume the increase, and the council would assume that burden until such time that that the balance of low rent areas and high rent areas could balance itself out. As new families moved into lower rent areas, the lower rent limits would apply. And so as those families turned over in those communities, that's where we would see budget neutrality in this. The other change in this is this one does not hold tenants harmless, 42% no change. This one holds tenants harmless, 68% have no change. The second option for implementation is that we implement on the second recertification. So HUD has a rule that you need to give families a 1-year notice that this is going to happen. So if you're going to do a reduction in their rent limit, we were going to do this, all of those families would get a 1-year notice that effective this date, your rent would go up by X, assuming all other things remain the same. Would give families an opportunity to choose if they want to remain in their current rent unit and pay the rent, additional rent, or they could have a year to decide that they want to move to a new unit with lower rent. So those are the options. Holding current families harmless, which costs the council money during the implementation year. And I say that's $2 million. That's enough to serve 210 families. So it's a reduction in service to 210 families, or implement on the second recertification. I thought it would be helpful to show you some maps on how this plays out in the region. And I need to get my bigger copy because I can't see this. And so I'm going to show you 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, and 3-bedroom maps because that's where most of our families are living. But areas in the red and in the orange will have reductions in rent limits. Areas in the dark blue and light blue will have increases in their rent limits. So families living in the blue areas would be, their rent would go down. Families living in the red and orange areas, their rent could potentially go up unless we choose to hold people harmless. Some of these communities, we have very few families living in. Some of the orange ones, we have a lot of families living in. All the areas that are white on these maps are not our service area. I should have had them take out those communities, but that's not the council service area for Section 8. For each bedroom size, these maps look similar, but there are some differences. Here's 2 bedrooms. Blue areas, the rent limits go up, meaning the family's portion goes down. Red and orange areas, the rent limits go down, so the family portion goes up. And here's the 3 bedrooms. Now I'm ready for some discussion on all of these. I'm ready for questions. I'm ready for discussion. So we have status quo, we have status quo plus, we have small area fair market rents. And what are your thoughts and comments and questions?
Thank you, Ms. Smith. You presented a lot of information very well and in an easy to understand format. Discussion, Councilmember Alice Ingebrigtsen.
Thank you, Chair. I kind of held my questions. One of the things that I'm wondering, you mentioned a number of scenarios during the course of the presentation. It would be helpful to kind of understand and have, I think in the presentation, you also provided some estimated costs that aren't in the actual presentation. It's just because it's a point of reference for me, at least going back to think about things, but I also think about the public. If those could be included in the future, that'd be helpful. One of the examples was about how, or as a con for a number of them, was how about when a voucher can't be used, because I'm assuming it's not enough to entice, or there's not a, I'm assuming it's because you can't, the amount of the voucher is not enough to compete with the cost that's there. And so my question is about the frequency. How often does that scenario play out?
Ms. Smith.
Mr. Chair and Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen, it's a real thing right now. With the market the way it is and the vacancy rates so low and the rents skyrocketing in our region, actually they're starting to taper up, but they have gone way up. Our success rates for voucher placement have gone down. And historically, for many years, our success rates were 80%, 90%. So 90% of voucher holders that get a voucher could use it. Back in 2014, it dropped to 14 or to 45%. For a lot of reasons, the market had a lot to do with it. We're back up a little bit from that, but we're at 56%. So 56% of new families coming off the waiting list that get a voucher are able to use it. The remainder of the vouchers come back to us. And there are all kinds of things that impact that. One is rent limits, having competitive rent limits. One is the rental market. One is finding a landlord that will rent to you. One is the age of our waiting list. Families that are on the waiting list for longer, maybe they've found other options for housing, so they no longer need the voucher. So there's all kinds of things that impact that, but it's at 56%.
Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
Just a follow up on that. So when they come back, we then issue them to someone else to use. So we're at full utilization, but there's a churn that takes place in that. Is that an accurate understanding?
Councilmember Lilligren, Chair Lilligren, Councilmember, yes, that's accurate. If a voucher comes back, it goes to the next person on the waiting list, essentially.
Councilmember.
With the ideas around the fair market rate, does that really address that issue because they'd have a more competitive rent?
Ms. Smith.
Mr. Chair and Councilmember, yes, absolutely. For some of the high rent areas in the region, some of those blue areas that I showed, even at the, as I indicated earlier, even at the maximum amount allowable under the current system, families can't touch units in those areas. So what it does is it opens up areas for voucher holders that they may not otherwise have access to, and it's adopting rent limits that are more localized, so it's really market driven. I think, you know, as I indicated, there are some areas in the region where we today have standards that are above what the average rent is in those communities. So the downside of it is to adopt the higher limits, you have to balance it out with reducing rent limits in some areas. And those are areas that have lower rents.
Councilmember.
Last follow up on this. So just to play out a scenario, if a family lived in Waterton with a two-bedroom home, and they wanted to move to Edina because they had a job change or something else, what would happen to that family? My scenario is their current voucher holder living in a two-bedroom in Watertown and need to move to Edina. What would happen in this scenario?
Chair Lilligren and Councilmember, they would get the new rent limit for Edina. So as any voucher holder is shopping, they would get the rent limits that are shown here, or that are adopted.
They have choice. They don't have to stay in the rent level that they're at, or there's not some complicated process they have to go through to get that. Thank you.
Chair and Councilmember, that's what this is about, is providing choice. That's in some cases not there under the current model.
Thank you. Further discussion, Councilmember Lindstrom.
If I'm understanding you correctly, it seems like the small area fair market option is addressing concentrated areas of poverty as well. That seemed to be the intent in the 24 or so different areas that are required to do it. That's what I took from your comments. Is that accurate? And do you think that would be effective?
Mr. Chair and Council Member, I think that's somewhat true. Part of it is creating that choice. So a lot of our areas of concentrated poverty in the region, some of them have lower rents, which would result in lower rent limits. Families have opportunity to move to those areas in some cases within our region because they have lower rent. What families don't have is the choice to move into some of these high rent areas because the rents are beyond what the voucher will support. So I would say in many areas of the region, families have choice. Right now, they don't have a lot of choice in some of the high rent areas. But what we don't want to happen is every voucher holder runs and moves to all these blue areas. That's not where people want to live. Not all people want to live, nor do we want them to. What it's about is if a family wants to move to that area, they can do so with their voucher.
Thank you. Councilmember? You seem like you're about to say something, Councilmember
Me?
Lindstrom. Yeah.
Oh, I always look like I have a
Right.
strange look on my face. Yeah. No.
Okay. Ms. Smith,
Just soaking it in.
thanks. Just kind of extending that, Councilmember Lindstrom's questions. Why? So the recommendation that comes from HUD on our, I can't remember what that compliance process or whatever, they recommend the small area proposal. Why is that? Why does HUD itself recommend that?
Mr. Chair, I think they recommend it as a strategy to set more realistic and real-time rent limits for our region. And with the idea that the reason it costs so much on the front end is because in any case, families that have the higher rent limits get the benefit immediately. And families that experience a decrease, you implement that over a 2-year period, or, as I outlined it, or hold them harmless. Either way, it costs money to the housing authority, but in the end, it's a strategy to balance rents out among a large metropolitan area such as ours.
Okay, thank you.
Could I
Director
add to
Barajas.
that too? Community members, thank you, Mr. Chair. The geography here, I think, too, is the thing that makes it, as Terry had said earlier, much more unique than just Bloomington or just St. Paul. The council's geography includes everywhere from Linwood Township to Medina, and we know just anecdotally off the top of our heads that's a huge difference in allowable rents. But if you scroll back at your presentation and look at our original map, we have the gray and the blue. That's the same rent limit across most of our geography except for 13 communities. And Edina being one of those exceptions, but even compared to, an Arden Hills compared to a Linwood Township is a big difference in rents, just what is in the marketplace. So that's a very coarse way of trying to allow for choice. And when we have such a large geography, to be able to dig in a little bit deeper and allow for more variety, both gives us the opportunity to not be overpaying in some areas, but also to be right sizing that rent limit for some of the closer in suburbs that have some of that higher, without necessarily going to that higher exception rent.
Thank you. Councilmember Atlas Singlerbitz and then Councilmember Bento.
This is to not Councilmember Barajas, but Director Barajas is that right? Is that right? Okay. Comment, but I would also be curious about the implications when you're in a lower rent community. If the housing vouchers are at a higher level, would that then raise or put some pressure on for non-voucher rentals to be at that same level too? Does that make sense? Is what I'm saying making sense? I'll give you an example. It happens in childcare. So if my son went to a childcare that received childcare that could take children with childcare assistance, and because of that, they had to charge everyone that rate for childcare, which was way higher than what you would see at a for-profit childcare facility. But I lived in North Minneapolis, and all of the childcare facilities received people with aid. So that meant childcare on the north side was much more expensive than it was in a place like, I know, isn't that crazy? So it raised the amount that people were charged, and they didn't have a choice. They weren't choosing. And so, that's what I'm trying to understand. Is that a potential effect of rent limits the way they are now?
Ms. Smith.
Mr. Chair and Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen, I think that's happening right now.
Okay.
The way we have them set, probably more so than under a small area fair market rent scenario, because of what Lisa pointed out on the gray map. I mean, Norwood Young America has the same rent limit as Coon Rapids.
Yeah.
And we know that rents in Norwood Young America are lower than they are in Chaska, in Coon Rapids. So I think we have more of it now.
Councilmember Bento.
Mr. Chair, Ms. Smith, so the $2 million council budget impact would be immediate, and what impact would that have? I mean, how do we, and I, frankly, District 11 is covered in this, but for those members of the council who represent Washington, Dakota, Bloomington, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Plymouth, how do we do that?
Ms. Smith?
So Chair Lilligren and council member, I'll answer the first question first because I think I understand that
Yeah,
one.
I'm
but
talking about the politics.
the $2 million impact is over a year's time.
Over a year.
Because I indicate, and that's just based on where people are living today, what their rents are. So, that's an estimate. But it's over a year's time, and as families move around, that number can change.
Yep.
But I think the big point to make is families that move get the higher benefits immediately and the lower benefits immediately if they move. But if they remain in place, we don't implement the lower limits until they move or in a year from when we notify them. So it's like 2 years. So that's where the budget impact comes in. And we have about 65 families go off the program every single month for a variety of reasons. They're mostly absorbed by other service areas around the country. And then those are slots we fill. And what would happen over a year's time is we likely wouldn't be able to fill all of those slots to get at, the 210 families that would be impacted.
Councilmember Bent?
Is there any scenario under which it could exceed 2 million?
Ms. Smith?
Councilmember Lilligren, yes, if everybody moves to Edina, we're in trouble. But we know that's not going to happen. I think we have a pretty good historical handle on family movement around the region and how long it takes to implement increased payment standards. Because we serve 7,000 families, it takes a lot of movement to make this happen. But could be more than 2 million. But then what happens is we would have a conversation with you and adjust the number of families we serving, adjust other things, to address that.
Thank you. I want to clarify, if I may, Councilmember, thanks. And Ms. Smith, you've explained this several times and very well, but I just want to make sure I'm understanding the dynamic here. And this goes to Councilmember Vento's question as well. So in option 3, the small area fair market rents, future years is budget neutral and reduces the program size initially by estimated 210 families. And so is the dynamic that it reduces it initially and then balances out over time, or it reduces it initially and that's where we would expect to stay throughout the life of the program? Please.
Councilmember Lilligren, I think I've indicated this maybe in past meetings, but for many, many years, we were able to serve all of our families with the budget we received from HUD. It's just been within the last 3 years that we have not been able to do that. So if the market levels out, if we balance the region out with lower rent limits in some areas, higher rent limits in others, that will balance each other out, but it takes place as people move.
Sure.
And housing costs level off and increase with inflation, we should be at a point where we can serve all of our voucher holders again. But it takes those things that are out of our control to make that happen.
Thank you. Thanks for your patience in explaining that. Councilmember Athelsinger-Bitson.
Okay, I got 2 questions. One is just, I want to make sure Golden Valley has like 4 colors going on. What, and that's a function of zip codes. I did not realize that. So, okay. And I'm just curious, it seems like it's a bit of an outlier comparatively to the rest of communities. And I'm curious, is there any weird thing? I'm not expecting an answer to this, but is there a weird thing that could happen as a result of that, or some weird dynamics for such a small community to have 4 different rent levels?
Ms. Smith.
Chair Lilligren and council member, it stuck out to us too as an oddity. And so you're reminded, we do need to look into that, and our researchers can help us dig into that as to why. But we were thinking, yes, that is odd and it's zip code based, but we need to dig into that and figure out why.
Thank you, Councilmember.
Anecdotally, I'm, 394, I think, is that line. Probably. Yeah.
169.
So maybe it could be right, but yeah, I think in the light, I'm looking at 2-bedroom map, 3-bedroom map. And I think the light blue section of that probably wouldn't be any different than the dark blue section of that, just because, I'm on Zillow all the time for no reason at all, because I'm not moving.
Director Barajas wants to add something.
Mr. Chair, council members, I would add that those southern two zip codes probably also include portions of Edina as well. Or, I'm sorry,
St. Louis Park.
St. Louis Park as well. And so there's that influence of that full zip code there. They just happen to have a piece that falls in those in Golden Valley. So we certainly can look into it a little bit closer, especially with the interstate there, if there's actually any real difference between the northern and southern portions in those areas.
My last question is something I've asked before about our actions taken to identify or understand private or other sources of funding that could help us with the issue of the gap. I know that housing issues in our region are super important and an issue that many foundations have been working collectively to get and gather and talk about regularly. And so I'm just curious what we've come to. Do we know, can we accept private dollars to support our gap and the needs, or what have we learned?
Ms. Smith.
Mr. Chair and Councilmember Atlas Engelbretson, we learned that we can not use any outside sources of funds outside of Section 8 reserves, program reserves, to pay for subsidy. I think we had this conversation maybe at a budget discussion a few months ago, and we learned from the feds that that's a rule in place, and so we don't have any option to use any outside forces. No philanthropy, no local funds, no general purpose levy, only Section 8 dollars, which are running out, as I indicated.
Seems punitive. Were you done, Councilmember Atlas Engelbretson? Councilmember Vento.
Yeah, it is. Actually, I think it is. You can tell me if. So, and I think I heard, can we accept funds for administrative costs?
Ms. Smith.
Chair Lilligren, Councilmember Vento, yes, we can.
Okay.
We just can't pay subsidy with it, but what we can't do is pad our administrative costs this year, so we have administrative fees at the end of the year to put into our pot for subsidy down the line.
That's what I was hoping we could do. Never mind.
Councilmember Atlas Engelbretson.
How much are our admin fees annually?
Ms. Smith.
So, Chair Lilligren, I'm tripping up on all these names.
It's Finette. It's Inga.
I know, right?
Inga and Brett had a son together. That's
Inga Brett.
exactly what it is. Inga and Brett got it on and had a son.
So,
Ms.
Mr. Chair, Council Member, what's the question again?
Sorry, I know that was distracting.
The amount, the cost of administrative.
Chair Lilligren and Councilmember Atlas Engelbretson, we get about $5 million each year in admin fees. We get paid a certain amount for every family we have under contract. But as we've talked before, those fees dwindle because, like this year, they're funding us 80 cents on the dollar. So those have been prorated at the lowest levels in the history of the program over the last few years. So that's problematic as well.
Just to clarify, I heard you correctly. We have $5 million annually in admin.
Ms. Smith.
And Chair Lilligren, Councilmember Atlas Engelbretson, and that doesn't cover all of our administrative costs. We pay $4 million alone in salary.
Councilmember.
So if you got money from other sources to cover admin funds, then the funds that weren't spent on admin that are part of the program could be spent on housing.
Ms. Smith.
Chair Lilligren and Councilmember Atlas Engelbretson, no. They they don't want you playing that game. So you're padding your pocket so you can put it in reserves to spend it on subsidy at the end of the year, right? That's what we would be doing. And we actually pose the question.
We asked them directly.
And part of it is why HUD doesn't want you to do that is agencies will go out and spend all kinds of local money or general purpose levy. And then because of the rule that current year funding predicts future year spending, then the next year the feds have to give us that much more. And that worked to our advantage in 2017 and 2018 when we used our own money, Section 8 reserves. We paid it out in subsidy. We got it back the next year from HUD. But we use Section 8 reserves, which are now down to the council's target fund balance. So that's not an option anymore.
Ms. Smith, what would be most helpful for you to hear from us tonight?
Well, Chair Lilligren, I guess I'd like to have a sense of, do you support small area fair market rents? Because based on what you tell me, that's what I will come back with on the 5th. If I had to make a recommendation today, that would certainly be my recommendation, that we come back as action for that. But I want to make sure I have your questions answered, see if I have your support.
So this is me as a council member. I would support the small area fair market rents. It seems, provided it's not overly burdensome, which you've explained it wouldn't be, but it does seem that there are benefits to real-time tracking and rent costs throughout the region if we're going to maximize choice, and that it's future budget neutral, I think has appeal. I mean, obviously there's going to be implementation contours to the budget as we go forward. So that's me. I don't have other council members care to weigh in. Councilmember Atlas-Engelbretson.
I'd agree, and I think with the only thing is I'd like to think a little or have some thought done, and if I need to be a part of this or someone from the city of Golden Valley, think about the implications for a community where it's bifurcated in that way or quadricated. I'm not sure what we'd call that, but I also am just as scanning, looking. There's other communities too that have like a little niche. That little Canada that has like a little kind of square that's cut out, and I'd just be curious of thinking about what could be any negative implications or odd things that might occur. I don't have a thought that there is one, but if there is that aspect of, does it support continued lower rents across the street, inside the same community? There might be some, unintended consequence, maybe. I don't know that that's the case, but just to maybe think through that a little more, where there's a community that is cut up. I'm seeing Brooklyn Center is also another one. Maybe there's some odd things in Crystal with that Crystal Robbinsdale border. I'm just curious if that's something worth looking into a little bit more before it comes, and having some thoughts around why those are there, and are there any odd things that come up with them?
Thank you. Ms. Smith?
Chair and council members, I wonder, it'd also be helpful for me to have your thoughts on whether you think it's a good policy decision to hold current tenants harmless, or do we want it implemented, gain the benefits of small area fair market rents sooner by implementing on the, second resort for families. So hold all current families harmless until they move, or implement a year from their notification, so essentially 2 years from now.
To stay congruent, Chair, with my feelings around minimum rent, I would want to hold families harmless at this time. Wages have not grown. We're still dealing with a lot of things. I realize that could have other implications, but that's my 2 cents on that.
Thank you. Councilmember Bento?
No, I'm just nodding my head.
Okay. Councilmember Cummings?
This is really hard, and I'm glad I don't have your job. But I would say, to me, the term status quo sounds so passive, and it's really not. It is making a choice. And I think that we can make a better choice than status quo or even status quo plus. So based on what we've learned tonight, I like the small area fair market rent that you're proposing. I think that sounds good. As far as option 1 or option 2, boy, that's that's really tough. My inclination is to go to all tenants within 2 years, the second option. But I also agree with what you say about holding current tenants harmless from rent increase. There's so many things that are impacting people now that another hit, I think, could be just extremely challenging for a lot of people. So I have to think that one through even further.
Thank you. Councilmember Lindstrom?
No, I agree wholeheartedly. I don't have anything to add with what's already been said.
Thanks. Councilmember Lee?
Yeah, I just second what Councilmember Lindstrom just said.
Thank you. So, Ms. Smith, if I'm hearing committee members correctly, well, I guess I'm not. So there's the hold current tenants harmless. We know that has a $2 million council budget impact, right? And do we know how we would close that hole, or Ms. Smith?
Chair Lilligren, it would be as families move.
Okay.
So families that we're holding harmless, once they move, then the new limits would come into play.
Okay.
So over time, that would change. And so that's how it would, change.
Okay, thank you. Do you have the direction you need? Just a sense of the committee?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Thank you, colleagues. This is not a fun conversation to have, but it's one we have to have. Any further comments or questions on this information item? Councilmember Cummings, and then it looks like Councilmember Atlas-Ingebrigtsen. Councilmember Cummings.
Just a quick comment. All of these policies and options and things are so complex, and you do such a great job at taking really complex ideas and making them understandable and bringing them down to where we can be able to hopefully make informed decisions. But thank you for what you and your staff do, because this is big stuff and it's very, very deep. So I appreciate what you do.
Here, here. Councilmember Atlas-Ingebrigtsen.
Thanks, Chair. I just want to, I realize we're in a situation currently where there are rules that preclude us from engaging others as a part of the efforts that we're trying to do for the communities we serve. So federal rules are preventing us from accessing and utilizing private dollars. But I just want to encourage us to continue to be aware of those opportunities. Federal rules change. And I think one of the things that I'm really mindful of is how are we preparing for when those changes come and we're ready for opportunities, and just kind of have like a little playbook for when things might change or might come, what could be potentials, and a way of managing and maintaining or building relationships with those who might be great partners for us in that. I'm not sure exactly what that looks like, but it's just something that's been on my mind lately after visits in Denver and met with some folks there around housing and social services, and a lot of things are changing, but they'll change again, and I think we just need to be ready for them.
Sure. Thank you, Councilmember. And I would just remind us all that the federal guidelines, the HUD guidelines, relate to the voucher program, to the HRA payment standards, and those relationships that you're talking about, whether it's philanthropy, corporate. Those are conversations we can have about the full housing spectrum outside of the confines of this program. And I think many of us are. So cool. Anything else? Thank you so much, Ms. Smith. And seeing no further business before this committee, we're adjourned.